Let me introduce myself very quickly. I'm Thomas Limberger. I'm the CEO of Silver Arrow Capital. We are an investment boutique advising on infrastructure projects and industrial projects. And I'm obviously here today to moderate a high esteemed panel of experts on a very, very interesting subject, namely, I would say, the core of everything, because we can talk a lot about projects, we can talk about building things, but at the heart of everything is the finance of these projects. And therefore, we have I would say, a very, very interesting panel here today, who will give us a broad overview of their industry-specific experiences in the private financing of such infrastructure projects, as well as general observations on where we can be better in the future, because now, I would say, the opening statement from my side is there is a large gap. We have the rail and transport networks under extreme pressure due to two topics. Number one, we need to build more in order to basically give enough rail or give enough infrastructure to achieve our plan 2030. On the other side, we have a very old infrastructure in place which needs to be renewed over time. Therefore, there is a financing gap, and that financing gap is getting bigger and bigger due to decreasing budgets from the public sector. And the answer to this, obviously, is only one. We need to look outwards into the private financing world in order to accumulate more money in order to achieve what we need to achieve, namely build the infrastructure we need to in order to satisfy the demand for cargo as well as public transport in up to 2030. Let me set the stage for the first time and give you some figures. Current studies show that we have about $1 trillion financing gap in order to achieve the growth forecast until 2030. That's point number one. Point number two, currently in Europe, 3% of the general government fixed capital has been invested in infrastructure in 2018, which by far is too little in order to achieve what the forecasts show in order to basically give all the players in this field enough capital to expand their structures as well as to renew the old structures. And I think one important fact is, from the private side, there is so-called dry powder, so uninvested finance of about $130 billion, not used for infrastructure financing because there is a lack of projects. What does that tell us? The lack of project tells us not that there is a lack of real projects, there is a lack of the bridge between the public sector and the private sector, and maybe also the policymakers. In order to bring all that together, we are here today to discuss with our experts the various, let's say, mechanisms and models we could use in order to actually bridge that gap. So let me introduce today's speakers. We have Dieter Hengl. He is a member of the board from UniCredit, and he will actually give us a very, very good insight from an institutional point of view on private finance. Then we have Vadim Mikhaylov, first deputy CEO of Russian Railways, so one of the largest infrastructure providers in the world, and actually his experience with private financing even as a state company, which I think is quite interesting. Third, Herr Karl Blaim from Siemens Mobility, CEO. Siemens Mobility obviously plays an interesting role because they are on the one side hardware supplier, on the other side also taking care of building those bridges between the hardware producer and the projects and actually public and private finance. So I think we'd be very happy to hear from him a lot of his experience. Mr. Gerhard Lahner from Vienna Insurance Group. He is the deputy board member, and I think Mr. Lahner will speak mainly out of the viewpoint of an institutional investor, which I think could be quite interesting, because I think also Vienna Insurance Group has a lot of examples of, let's say, private financing in the public sector, and this could be very enlightening. Then Andrew Meaney, from OXERA Consulting, a partner. Andrew is working more on the, let's say today, at least in his speech, more on the, setting the stage for what kind of mechanisms in public and private finance do we have, and how can we play with those. And last but not least, Stefan Buske from Buske Law. He's a lawyer, but also a finance expert in the infrastructure sector. And Mr. Buske will give us at the end, I would say, a very rounding picture on, let's say, the facts and figures of global infrastructure, including rolling stock, which is another aspect of just the pure infrastructure. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time and for your input. I would like to give the word to Mr. Mikhaylov to start his speech on his views on Russian railways in relation to public and private finance. Mr. Mikhaylov, to maybe get this discussion started, I always sort of like formulated two questions for each individual presentation in order to get, let's say, the thought process going. And from my point of view, I would like to know, you know, Russian Railways, as I said, one of the largest infrastructure companies in the world, publicly owned, connecting the East with the West for decades. How does RZD, as a state-owned company, use private financing sources in order to support their infrastructure growth within and outside of the country? That would be my first, let's say, question. And the second one is, could you give us some examples and indications on, let's say, the volume of private financing and, let's say, the scope of how much private financing Russian Railways is taps into since I would say several years. So, Mr. Mikhaylov, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
I hope it works. Thank you very much, Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome for our session. I think it's not bad. After the lunch, we got approximately 80% of the auditorium full, which is, I think, quite remarkable things, especially after the lunch. And it shows some interest to the topic that Thomas mentioned above. The scale of the company, our company, in truth, is agenda in our industry with respect to attracting the money. Overall, approximately 25% of the investment is funded by the private money in the Russian railways. Infrastructure investment is attractive to investors principally because it generates stable and predictable returns for a long-term period. The only job we have to do is to make it as transparent as possible when it put forward proposal for investment, as correctly mentioned by Thomas. One of the biggest disappointment was the projects are not presented in the right way to the investors. We've been talking about this for a long period of time. Of course, the government would like to fund everything in the cheapest way using the internal sources, but of course it's a lack of finance from governmental sourcing. It's quite obvious that we need to find the private money. But it's an interesting thing, as also Thomas correctly mentioned in the beginning. We have observed there is a competition for available investment because it's too much money chasing too few well-presented investment deals at this moment. And the bad news that in 2018, over 129 billion US dollars that was earmarked by investors for infrastructure was simply not invested because the project didn't have appropriate funding schemes. So how can we attract the money and get it invested in our project? That's the problem. Generally speaking, some of the railways companies have learned over the years only how to ask the government for the money, but as you know, it's a different art. The most important thing is to, as I said, pact the project and try to go and find a source for finance outside the governmental one. Investors prefer to invest in projects where they perceive economic growth to be. Economic growth reduces long-term risk. Investment in the strategic cargo hub is a gate to transcontinental railways project. Therefore, if, for example, you build a rail cargo gateway to the different large economies of Asia right here in Vienna, This will connect the investors not only to entry and exit points of cargo, but also to the future of the fastest growing economy in the world. As with the Russian railways, you know that we get the ratings, investment grade ratings from 3 major rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And currently our investment grade rating 1 notch over the sovereign rating, which is quite unusual, especially for emerging market. It helps us a lot, answering Thomas' question, to attract the private money. And at this moment, with the annual investment program around 7 billion euros, we've got a debt portfolio around, so far, we accumulate debt portfolio 5.9 in the US dollar equivalent. Basically, it's a mix of euros, Swiss franc, British pounds, euros, and the rubles. We are quite proud that we are only one Russian company who tap the UK market with 20 years bonds in British pounds and 7 years maturity bonds in the Swiss francs. Currently, the company has developed a huge investment program till 2025. It's roughly 120 billion euros till 2025 we have to attract and invest. Half of them belong to the Russian railways, and half of them it's a private money, private project like concession. We're quite proud that in September 2018 we signed the first railroads concession in the Russian Federation. It's called the North Pass Railway. It was agreement between the Russian Federation and the SPV North Pass Railway, and the total amount of this project is 1.5 billion euros, over 100 kilometers railways, and we will have a new cargo in approximately 20 million tons. So apart from that, we're trying the new instruments. For example, we're talking right now about traffic bonds, which is quite new and unusual in Russia. I believe it's with such kind of project like a broad gauge that was mentioned in the beginning of our today Congress, we are on a good position to do such kind of instrument, but not limited to this one, of course. And if we present common cross-border project to investors, because I think it makes the offer very stronger. Where it's necessary, we will negotiate with our authorities all the necessary changes. We fulfill from our side all our obligations, and we believe that private money, with the lack of the state financing for such, and you can see on the slide, for such huge projects which connect Asia and Europe, will make a lot of sense. And different type of the instrument that I mentioned, just project finance, traffic bonds, concession, just simple borrowings, give a lot of opportunity to our financial institutions participate in this project, as well as the private investors. That's my main point, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Vadim. Next in line is Andrew Meaney, partner of OXERA. And Andrew, I think interesting to the auditorium would be, what types of financing models are available for rail infrastructure in general? I think you can give a very, very good outline on let's say the landscape of what we can play with. Then second of all, the supplementary to what are the key differences between them? So everybody heard about PPP and various other models, but maybe you can explain to us a little bit what are the differences and what especially the policymakers have to look for in order to actually apply the one or the other. And third of all, in a world of government borrowing being severely constrained and balance sheet treatment of investments particularly being more important, and I think balance sheet treatment is the key word here, compared to what we usually are used to in Austria as well as in Germany and other constituencies. What is the role of risk allocation between the state and the public and private sector? So Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I will try to answer your questions. Yeah, so I'm a partner at OXERA. We work from our range of offices across Europe, really across the infrastructure sectors and also in financial services. Those of you who were there will have seen that we've just signed a memorandum of understanding with Mr. Sharapov from IEDT. So where we're working on projects, we will partner on a multidisciplinary basis with other organizations such as that. My background is in corporate finance. I wrote a paper a few years ago with one of my colleagues for the International Transport Forum, comparing different types of financing models for infrastructure, where we can really put the state together with the private sector. And I'm going to talk about some of these models now. Okay, so the ones I'm going to be looking at here are the three that you can see on the slide. So the PPP, or public-private partnership. Another model is a concession to operate, maintain, and renew a piece of railway infrastructure. And the third one is the so-called regulatory asset-based model, or the RAB model. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the relationship there between the state, the asset, and the private sector investors. I'm going to be providing a high-level characterization of these models. Those of you who are familiar with them will know that they can all sort of blend into one another quite easily. I'm going to stick to a characterization that allows me to draw some of the differences out. So starting then with the PPP model, they're frequently deployed for rail infrastructure development. I would characterize them as the state committing, and this is the important word, committing to a long-term contract for the construction and operation of the asset. Investors from the private sector are then willing to take risk in the areas that they control under that contract. Construction prices, making sure the new services are able to run on day one. But they are able to control under the contract, which is quite rigid, the areas in which they take risk. Concessions are also used for rail infrastructure, particularly when the state has constructed an asset and then wants a private sector partner to operate, maintain and renew it over the long term. Sometimes they are accompanied by a so-called regulatory regime in terms of setting prices, setting quality standards that can be updated over time. And that provides a bit of flexibility as the macroeconomy changes or the rail market changes. But generally, risks are managed in accordance with the contract. The regulatory asset-based models, they're less used for railway developments, but they are increasingly being used for large new utility assets. And that's in addition to their usual role for setting price caps for utilities. What they do is provide investors with the confidence that their investments will be remunerated, they will be allowed to earn a reasonable return on them, but also it allows the state the ability to manage change under the contract. Now I'm just going to move on and talk specifically about some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks under each of these models. So the PPP models, those on the left of your screen, they combine this important commitment from the state to a long-term contract with a set of quite explicit rigidities, which, as we know, can prove quite expensive to resolve if the macroeconomy or the rail market changes during the period of that contract, 20 years, 30 years, or potentially even more. In my experience, much of the success or failure when you choose a PPP model depends on the types of risks that are borne by investors and the fact that they are able to bear those risks. What's also important is that the government sticks to the commitment in the contract, because it can be very expensive to change the terms of this contract, really by design, because it's designed to ensure that the government commits over a long period of time. Concessions, the one in the middle of your picture, they provide a different balance between, on the one hand, commitment and on the other, rigidity. Some contractual provisions can be made to change. For example, at particular milestones in the contract, they can allow for reassessments of different elements of the contract. But otherwise, the expectation is that the contract has primacy. And even if that does cause affordability issues for the next people down the train, the railway undertakings who are using the concessioned infrastructure. The RAB model, the one on the right as you're looking at it there, provides investors with more exposure to the state's degree of commitment, but it does allow investors and stakeholders a clear framework for making changes to charges to users and investor remuneration. So just coming on to your question there, Thomas, about the government balance sheet treatment. One of the reasons for, as we've been talking about already in this session, for using private financing of rail assets is to avoid pressures on government finances. Rail is competing for government finance and sometimes funding against things like health, schools, etc., etc. There are a lot of other things that politicians may wish to spend money on other than railways, although we do quite well, I would say. What private finance can do is keep new rail assets, or even old rail assets potentially, off the government's balance sheet. But as we know, the rules, particularly in the EU and also outside the EU, mean that you can only move an asset off the government's balance sheet or keep it off the government's balance sheet if there is sufficient risk transfer in the underlying initial agreement around building the infrastructure, and also the contracts then between the infrastructure manager and the railway undertaking and its other users. While investors may charge less for financing if some of the risks are held by government, for example through a volume guarantee or provisions that pass cost risk onto operators with a public service contract, these provisions are likely to be looked at unfavourably by those deciding whether or not an asset is owned by the government. The risk is that a project that should have been able to access private finance ends up being effectively financed by the state and under government control. Avoiding this situation, in our experience, relies on a clear assessment of whether risk transfer is sufficient to meet the international rules for keeping an asset off the government's balance sheet. Ladies and gentlemen, it's clear to me, and our other speakers, and Thomas has already said this, that private finance is willing and ready to participate alongside the state in the development of rail infrastructure and is familiar with the models that I've outlined to you. I think it's now over to us as people, as participants in the rail industry, to help investors to help us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew. It was maybe one short question to you. How do you feel in your current experience with these projects? How do you feel the public sector is involved in structuring these kinds of new models you've, or new/old models you've presented? Is the public sector really actively engaging with the private sector, or do you think this is still sort of like a pull? The private sector sort of has to pull the public sector towards those projects?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of enthusiasm for rail amongst private investors, but I believe that the state and state authorities can do much more to present schemes that are ready for private investors to get their teeth into, really. Yeah. And almost you can see the worst of both worlds, which is the state saying, we want private sector finance into this particular asset, and then nothing happens for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And you can get investors saying, right, we're ready, and then the government sort of disappearing and not communicating again, and that can be very frustrating, and those investors can go to another sector quite quickly.
Yeah. So that could explain the allocation, the unallocated money currently available for infrastructure. Absolutely. Which Mr. Mikhaylov has actually mentioned. Yeah. Now to the next participant on this panel, Mr. Dieter Hengl from UniCredit. For me, Mr. Hengl, it would be interesting to see, if you could provide us with some details on how a PPP project can be financed today, and your experiences as the leader of a very large bank, Second, what is the benefit of a PPP structure for public entities and sovereigns? So why should I invest in something which I don't really know, and where we just learned the public sector sort of also really doesn't currently sort of understand on which mechanism they should use? And thirdly, could you give us an example of a PPP here in Austria or in the CEE which was successful or maybe even unsuccessful in the past years?
Yep, thank you very much also for the invitation to this panel here. My name is Dieter Hengl, and as you can see, I'm working quite long in the banking industry in this look at just at my gray hairs, and I think this links very well also to project finance and PPPs, because it's more or less a bet for up to 30 years, sometimes even more. So you need to predict the future for 30 years, what is clearly a challenge. Coming to UniCredit, UniCredit is a pan-European commercial bank, and on the project finance side, we are clearly one of the leading banks here in Europe. We are active in this field for more than 25 years. We clearly focus on infrastructure and energy projects. Sometimes also health is, I think, quite well fitting for PPPs or project finance. We are clearly the #1 in Italy, in Austria, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. We have a very broad experience in this respect. Maybe just at the beginning, 2 examples for PPPs, for project finance out of last year from 2018. One I want to mention is the airport in Belgrade. There was the RFP provided for the privatization of the Belgrade airport. I think then VC was winning. VC paid for the concession roughly 500 million euros and committed for an additional capex facility of additional 500 million. So in total, roughly 1 billion euro, and the aim was really to modernize the Belgrade airport and become one of the major hubs in Central and Eastern Europe. We have been there the sole advisor, we have been the debt advisor, we have been investor, we have been done the hedging, we have been security agent, and blah, blah, blah. So also just these roles give you an overview of the complexity of these projects also mentioned before, and maybe this is sometimes also why public entities are a little bit reluctant to enter in it. A second example from last year was Open Fiber. Open Fiber was a big investment in fiber infrastructure in Italy. So this was 3.5 billion euros, so really a huge one. We provided as UniCredit there an underwriting for 1/3 of it, and it was then also successfully structured and syndicated. So there was a huge appetite also for this type of project. So what is important on project finance, PPPs? I think you need to inline the interests of all stakeholders, what is sometimes extremely challenging. First, you have the clients. So you have the client which has an interest to get it structured. Then you have the investors, and there are different type of investors on the table. You have banks. So, and for banks, it's extremely challenging currently to provide funding for 30 years, or to be more frank, it's impossible for banks to provide funding for, I would say, if we come in the range up to 20 years, many banks have zero appetite. We usually finance 10, 12, maybe 14 years, but then it's done. So you need partner who provide the funding for this type of investments. And there you have, of course, into the international finance institutions like EBRD or IFC, or you name those names. And you have important institutional investors. They do have appetite for up to 13 years. For example, insurance companies, investment funds, infrastructure funds. So you need to structure these projects in a manner that all these different stakeholders have enough appetite to invest in. And I think that's crucial for the success of these type of projects. You asked before, is there, let's say, a big move from public institutions into PPPs? I would say no. There is, in certain countries, the need for it. In Austria, we had also a very limited one. There was one small motorway which we structured. It was the so-called, I don't know about the Umfahrungszettel. Then we had a hospital, smaller one, which was structured in a PPP project. We structured this as well. The largest one, the famous hospital North here in Vienna, was not done via a PPP, and this brings me immediately to the risks. So I think the big advantage for public institutions to go for PPPs is a risk sharing. With banks and with institutional investors. Why? I think the construction risk is the key element in a project. You can have cost overruns, time passes by. Take the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg. So, and these construction risks, these you can pass on as a public entity to the general constructor, to the SPV. I think this is the key benefit, which maybe mitigates to a large extent the high complexity and, of course, the higher funding costs. Because usually, Germany, Austria, France, UK, of course, they can fund cheaper if they place a public bond. Same is true for Russia. So if they place a bond, it's cheaper than if a corporate attracts money. I think this is the key benefit. Another example in Central and Eastern Europe is, for example, the D4, this is the metro in Slovakia, was also a 1 billion project which we have been underwriting and structuring. There the investor was Macquarie, for example, a typical infrastructure fund. Then we had Hochtief, Ferrovial, then we had POR as an investor. So this is typically the layer where you have then the loans for banks, up to 10 years. Here we had even a 20-year tranche. Then you have mezzanine, then you have the institutional tranche. This is very typical for this type of financing.
Thank you very much. What would interest me, Mr. Blaim, is how is Siemens, as a, let's say, as a product supplier, a big industrial group, see his role or its role in this whole process? Because obviously you're not only supplying, hardware, you're also on, let's say, the mitigator on the finance side. You have, I think especially your company has a lot of cross functions into literally any area. How does Siemens handle, projects like this, especially within your scope of expertise, which is the rail business? And on the other side, do you see yourself as a change agent for these kind of projects also? Or again, my question to you, is this sort of like a, you have to pull the tooth out of somebody in order to basically get this project rolling?
Yeah. Good introduction, Thomas. Thank you. First of all, again, thank you for also inviting somebody from the supplier industry. And I actually would like to connect on what Mr. Hengl has said, that pulling off a public-private financing is a difficult undertaking where many different stakeholders are going to involved, and often enough also the supplier base is getting into that. So therefore what you said is probably right, that also the supplier is a vital part of pulling off, and wouldn't call it pulling teeth for the time being, but pulling off a public-private financing. Therefore, I would like to look into that subject matter a little bit from the E&M side, also the equipment and maintenance supply base. When we look into the rail market, we consider that to be something around 120 billion. But if I resonate what I have been hearing today, I probably have to go back to our market analysts and challenge them a little bit, because of, I mean, if we pull all what we have been hearing today, then the market certainly will grow faster. Which actually also the forecasts say, because of if you look into the development of the population and the forecast of traveled rail miles by our customers, that's completely going off in the years to come. And that actually means what we are discussing here today, that probably that gap which is widening in the near future cannot be financed by governmental funds only, that the private institution have to come into play. So therefore that's a massive chance at the end of the day, a massive chance for all of us. I mean, somebody said it today in the morning, I don't know who it was, but there might be the golden age of railway coming up, and we all hope so. And by the way, it's not only a matter of concrete and steel to cater for that capacity increase. It's often also a matter of intelligence, software, automatic train operation, fleet management systems and alike, where also intelligent investments can do a lot. I was thinking about, and based on also empirical evidence, what has to happen that we altogether attract the interest of the private finance institutions into such large-scale investment programs. And even if we from the supply industry are burning or desiring to sell something to our customers, I mean, in such instances we need the financing institution. And if I look back into certain incidents, and now we are coming to pulling the teeth maybe, the financial institution, they do want and need, first of all, a broad support by all stakeholders. I mean, being it the politicians, being it the government, things like governmental guarantees and stuff like that are certainly helpful to pull private financing off. The second, and this also has been said, I think by you, Andrew, the project scope and the functionality has to be defined. I mean, it does not help the discussion with the private financial institutions if we do not know what we are talking about. And there might even be then a lack of interest in discussing it even further if we do not know what we have to talk about it. And last but not least, it is a matter of risk allocation and a balanced risk allocation, and it has to be manageable between the different parties, not only between the financial institution, but also between the industrial bases, because of, I mean, the risk should be allocated to those parties who can influence the risk at the end of the day. I mean, I have seen also in my history contracts where the risk of inflation for 20 years should reside with the supplier base. I mean, we can do a lot, I promise, but we cannot influence the inflation of certain economies. There's a bad news. If I look into the supplier base like Siemens, what we can do is we are a technology company who can design, produce and commission railway infrastructure solutions. What we cannot do is also not finance such large-scale infrastructure projects, because our balance sheets are also just simply too small. However, there is also some good news, because we can probably do something to make the financing cheaper. Because at the end of the day, what what a financing institution is looking into such large-scale infrastructure projects. They are just simply dealing with the risk. They're looking into the risk, how big is the risk and how can it be mitigated. So therefore, at the end of the day, if the supply base works closely together with the customer base, but also with the financing institution, to scope the project right, to allocate the right project scopes to the ones who can influence also the risk in the project. If they get early on in the scoping, in the definition also of the risk assessment and share that with the financing, I guess at the end of the day, the financing costs can be better judged, and a financing institution do not have to just simply work with risk factors or unknowables and therefore just simply price it too high. I wanted to share one example which we have been, because we also were asking about example, which we have been implementing, not in Austria, not in Germany, but in the UK. It was 2013 when we signed a large PPP project in the UK. It's part of the 6 billion upgrade project in central London, the Thameslink project. We do supply 115 trains or 1,400 cars. We did construct 2 depots where the maintenance is being done, and we entered into a service contract for 35 years to service the fleet and committed to the availability. Don't want to go into details, but at the end of the day, that was at the end from my point of view, a very good cocktail between all the ingredients you need from a supplier base. It had a blend of grants, it had a public financing element, and we even put private capital down into a special purpose company, also from the supply base from Siemens, which then at the end of the day also persuaded the financing institution. I think we had 13 banks engaged to put also a very attractive and competitive debt financing in place. Yeah, also it's not pulling the teeth, but it's certainly highly complicated with a lot of interfaces, and I guess if we bring together all the interest from all related parties, it can really make sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Lahner, from how does Vienna Insurance Group see such a development as an investor? Because I think that's your main viewpoint, obviously, here, as an institutional investor. And is this, I would say, current situation we're in attractive for an insurance to be an institutional investor in such projects? Are they too long-term or maybe too short-term? I don't know what your definition of long and short is in the insurance business. On the second question, I would like to ask, do you think the regulatory environment currently is sufficient to support such investment types, especially with the investment policy you have in your company?
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the questions. As already mentioned, I'm representing an institutional investor, and being the fifth in a row, a lot of things have been already mentioned. So I will especially focus on our insurance view on that. And if you take a look to our business model, I think that infrastructure investment usually should fit perfectly to our balance sheet. I mean, just to give you little bit of something that our liabilities are 100 years plus. Yeah, so after 100 years, somebody wants to get the money back, so we have to do something about this, which is not easy in times like this, but sometimes we meet with all the stakeholders here already mentioned. So we meet the banks, we meet the project developers, we meet the state. So, and this gives already part of what makes it so complex. I mean, the project, you have different interests, and I think that important for us as an institutional investor and as a long-term investor, we would like to see that when you take the PPP, the last word, partnership, that partnership starts at the end. So I think that what has been mentioned is we need to create a trustful basis amongst the institutions involved. And as we're the largest insurance group in CEE, we really love CEE. But it's a heterogeneous market. And this leads to the second question that you mentioned. I think that for us as a long-term institutional investors, the basis for all this is predictability. Predictability starts with two things. One is trustful partnership. That means that you know what are the expectations, that it's might be clear that the one or the other wants a higher risk, higher return, shorter investment horizon, the other one being completely opposite, searching for long-term stable yield income like insurance companies. And the second part for predictability is the even more complex one, which is regulations. You asked if I see sufficient regulations. I find the word sufficient quite interesting in this respect. I think that there is a lot of regulation, and that the problem with regulation is that it's as heterogeneous as the market that we have in front of us. So what we would appreciate is more multilateral coordination, more unification, more standardization of such regulations around infrastructure investments, because it's really complex to always grasp the core of the project. And when around this you also have to deal with certain different regulations, then it makes it highly complex and highly risky for us to invest. Mentioning this, again, we are happy to take 30 years plus on our books. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bube, you as a financial expert, you can surely give us an overview of, let's say, the general outsets of the infrastructure market developments, but also I would like to understand know your opinion on, how to close that specific gap which we're currently talking about. You have on the one side the public financing, on the other side the, let's say, in development private financing. So how do you think that gap can be closed? And what do you think is the future role of private funding in such developments? Is it more a passive role? Is it an active role? Has the private sector the driving force in order to basically realize these public projects at the moment? Or what do you think is in the future the sort of like the main driver in order to get this all together? Because we're not only talking about projects sometimes, we're also talking about various constituencies and countries which are involved in these projects. So it makes it even more difficult if you look on the multidimensional level.
Thank you very much, Thomas. First and foremost, many thanks for the invitation, for being here, and for being able to participate in this very exciting event. I think what I want to discuss with you today is about the challenges and opportunities in rate finance. Let me first quickly introduce myself. How does this work? Grün? Okay, now it works. Okay, let me first introduce myself. We are working in a very small boutique in Munich, and we are focusing only on corporate finance and transport finance with a particular emphasis on rolling stock. And we are only advising corporate investors and public authorities in terms of investment into infrastructure and rolling stock investments. So we've heard already this morning about the golden age. It was already cited here, and the outstanding prospect for rolling stock finance. Perhaps I need to rub some salt into this wound, and I have a bad message and a good message for you. The bad message is that we are focusing, or we are looking at a very, very we are looking at high investments in the future, and we are experiencing an investment gap which needs to be closed, and the only way to close the investment gap is to just focus on, or to attract further private investment in the infrastructure sector. So what are we talking about in terms of the broad picture? What we are talking about is that we need $50 trillion. This is a 12-digit number, we need 50 trillion US dollars to be invested in infrastructure, according to the World Bank and McKinsey. And only 12% thereof are covered by private finance, with the bulk thereof being invested in rolling stock rather than the infrastructure itself. Globally, the railway market is expanding, as we heard already this morning. The growth rates in Western and Eastern Europe are around 3%, and if we talk about Russia in particular, it is only 1%, but Russia most recently, namely in 2018, established an investment program in its infrastructure with a volume of 82 billion euros, including high speed and freight. And if you just look at the Russian market in particular, this means that 21,000 kilometers of railroad are either newly built or refurbished, and that 1.3 billion euros are invested in rolling stock, which translates into 23,000 locomotives. And if you just look at the infrastructure program itself, it is explicitly providing for private finance. 1/4 thereof is supposed to be financed privately, with only 3/4 being financed by the public sector. So there is some room to attract further investments. So looking at these truly impressive numbers, we are experiencing a significant investment gap in the future. And the investment gap is about 8 billion euros per year in order to conform to the annual growth rate. This means for Germany it's slightly higher, it's 0.5% of the GDP. For Russia it's 0.3%. But this investment gap must be closed to prevent ourselves from economic downturn and the effects thereof on our overall economy. So how do we close the investment gap? And we already heard the banking view, we already heard the suppliers' view, we already heard about the different financing models. But it's always boiling down to the same, I think, considerations, and the considerations are political commitment. We need affordable debt. We need a secure legal framework, and not more regulation, but deregulation. You need to assess country risk, and if you just look at the cash flows, you need to assess the risk of cash flows on its way from the investor to the project, and once the project is completed, from the project back to the investor. So, and we already also discussed, the last point is also of particular importance, clear risk allocation. Risk needs to be controlled by those who are managing the risk. You can deviate therefrom, but then the risk is factored in, which is making perhaps the price prohibitive, at least at some stage. And if you look at the next picture, this is giving you some thought, because the red line is showing the overall investment volume, and the blue line is showing the private participation therein. So there's room for improvement. I think you agree there with. So how can this be achieved? We have, I think, 3 pillars to achieve this. And this is, the key drivers are efficiency and cost, quality and innovation, and of course attracting further private capital. And efficiency and cost means a better asset utilization and a reduced cost, control of cost overruns, and what have you. And then, of course, in terms of quality and innovation, participation of the private sector in the technological development, and to have state-of-the-art technology being invested in the respective country and being operated by the respective operators. And private capital may be closing the gap because it is driving the growth. There's plenty of liquidity out there which is looking for attractive investment. And one of the very, very attractive investments, perhaps not for banks who are not prepared to lend for 30 years, but clearly for insurance companies, and the insurance companies know their cash needs over the upcoming years. They have their desk panels. They know their commitments over the upcoming years. So they are key investors in this market, and you don't want to particularly look. Sorry for this, but you may want to particularly look at institutional investors and insurance companies in particular as partners for infrastructure investment. And the private, what we also need to mention is that the private sector may be leveraging the know-how which is already there and keep it to the next level. And I come to the next slide, and I don't want to bother you too much there with, because Andrew already gave you an idea of the different financing models which are out there. The only thing I want to mention is that PPP, or public-private partnership, is in itself not a miracle cure for the project itself. It may alleviate financing, it may assist with bigger projects, but PPP is in itself not doing the trick unless you know what you want to do. So this, I think we can skip this page because we already heard about risk mitigation, we already heard about traffic shortfall agreements, offtake agreements, how to secure stable funding and cash flows over the lifetime of the project. And this is bringing me to the last page, and I think this is the good news. The good news is, and this is what we heard already this morning, and this is what we heard already here, is that we have an outstanding prospect for infrastructure finance as such, and for rolling stock finance in particular. And this is driven in particular by further liberalization of the markets. It is also driven by limited public funds, and we have an enhanced regulatory framework, at least for Europe, where you can access your assets, and which is allowing also investors to secure the asset-based finance. So overall, we have a very, very positive outlook, and I think it's worth to working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buske. Thank you to the panel for giving us a very, very short glimpse on a extensive topic which probably we could discuss in a separate conference any day. I would like to also thank the audience. I think my closing remarks, we all together are here in this game of changing the public sector as well as the private sector in order to supply to, let's say, or in order to cater the needs of the infrastructure development of the future. I would like to thank also Mr. General for organizing this event and also giving maybe an input to the future years of such an event, is that we are obviously looking for more finance people here in this room in order to basically give the money to develop these projects which we're going to have in the future. And it also shows the efficiency of the finance guys here in this panel. We just closed almost ahead of time, namely 2 minutes. So I would like to thank you very much for your attendance and your appreciation of this group, and I hope to see you soon again in the next events. Thank you very much.